Hello and welcome to the podcast, The Breathing Body. In this podcast, I invite you to journey through conversations which share the fascination of the physical matter we inhabit, the breathing body. We will explore its inherent intelligence, movement, healing, and much more. My name is Florina and I'm the host of this podcast. I'm an osteopath with a background in dance and yoga and based in London, where I practice, lecture and research. And I'm so happy that you are here. Thank you. I'm looking forward to share this episode with you, in which I'm talking to Judith Kleinman. Judith initially trained as a musician at the Guildhall School of Music and then went on to train to be an Alexander teacher as well as a yoga and Tai Chi teacher. Judith currently teaches at the Royal College of Music and the Junior Academy of Music, alongside being a co-head of training at the London Centre for Alexander Teaching and Alexander Teacher Training. Judith also collaborates with Thu Mary on the Developing Self project, as well as the Ready List project for the public. She has co-written the book The Alexander Technique for Musicians with her husband Peter Buchok, and The Alexander Technique for Young Musicians. Recently, Judith wrote her own book called Finding Quiet Strength, to share her approach to self-regulation and connections to well-being through touch, thought, movement, and breath. And this is what we talked about in today's episode. This conversation was a particularly profound and meaningful one for me, as I met Judith in person and we spoke sitting in her kitchen, hearing all the pigeons and birds from her garden in the background. The morning when I had this conversation, I woke out feeling slightly wobbly and anxious. And when I left Judith's place, I was in such a different place within myself. I felt more connected to myself, to my feet, and to the support from the ground underneath. And I was much more in touch with my breath. I felt safe, and I suddenly had a glimpse of knowing how to overcome present challenges. And this is what we talked about with each other. We talked about what the Alexander Technique is and how it offers so wonderful and potent tools to find what Judith calls quiet strength. This soft spot where we feel at ease and safe within ourselves, and we can touch into the body's wisdom and allow the body to undo rather than so forcefully trying to correct ourselves. Judith even invited all of us through a little AT sequence to find back to our breath, which was so powerful. Go ahead, listen, enjoy. Welcome, Judith, on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here.
Yeah, and it feels particularly special because actually we are both sitting opposite each other, almost half in Judith's kitchen and half in the garden. And that's why you hear, listeners, nature is with us as well. And there are some seagulls and all the wonderful creatures in your garden. Mm-hmm. I'm really looking forward to spend the next couple of minutes, half an hour or more, to talk with you about this very miraculous and yet mysterious body we inhabit. Mm. And to talk with you about your work, which is the Alexander Technique. Mm. And I remember so well when I found to the Alexander Technique, which was in Holland when I studied dance, and I had this wonderful teacher, Eva Karzak, and I left her place and I felt, wow, I found the art of creating space. Since then I've called it the art of creating space within my body. And I deeply fell in love with the Alexander technique. And maybe a nice place to start is to ask you what brought you to the Alexander technique, or what made you fall in love with this wonderful tool?
That's such a good question, because I think we're also united in an interest in music, and that I came to the work through being a musician and going to music college, and there was Alexander technique available there, which was so fortunate, because I also I was sort of in a little bit of trouble because I'd been in a car accident, and although physio and all sorts of other things sort of helped a bit, I couldn't get back to being comfortable and easy, not just with my movement or getting out of pain, but also just, as you say, the sense of breathing and the confidence that can bring, that you can come back to that in an easy way. And there were the lessons available, and I started to realize that I needed a way to sort of compose myself, as well as to be able to
That's wonderful.
to look after the music that I was making, and that they were more integrated than I realized. And that in a way, what I sometimes say to people is that, our first instrument, our first skill really needs to be self-regulation, how to look after ourselves. And I think so often things happen to us, maybe the education system or trauma or difficult family life or problems in one way or another, that sort of disenfranchise us from our bodies. We sort of lose the sense of how to be easy in our bodies and how to be free with our breathing. And Alexander came along, and it's a sort of framework for thinking, I think, is a way of putting it. It creates a framework of how to not just think of thinking as an academic skill or imaginative skill, but a way to connect to the thinking body, that the sense of the body can connect with our thought and our attention and awareness. And that's a skill we can develop, a bit like a language skill, that we can sort of notice that we get separated from it, the body, and get all caught up just in thought. And then we can find ways to think and connect to the body, which helps us, I'd say, to come home to ourselves, really. A sense of befriending and kind connection to the body, rather than this just sort of, it's there, and all we're paying attention to is what we're thinking or feeling. And when we can integrate all of that, it's just such an agency for well-being.
I love what you said. You had to find a tool to compose yourself. That makes me think of how the Alexander technique is also so much about inhibition, taking a pause, just stopping for a moment, and how much potential there is when we take a pause, which sometimes maybe sounds a bit, oh no, I have to keep going forward. Would you mind telling a little bit about that? Also that breath for the listeners who don't know yet what the Alexander technique is.
So I think what Alexander found was that the brain works very much as a prediction system. So we're sort of predicting, a bit like once you know how to play your instrument, you're sort of you're in a sort of movement with a sort of unconscious awareness. You're just doing things like walking or sitting or breathing, and it's just at a sort of subconscious level. And what Alexander realized was that we can draw our awareness up to a conscious level to notice maybe what's getting in the way. Maybe we learned something under pressure, or we observed patterns in other people that weren't quite so easy as we could allow ourselves to be. And I think that's a very fantastic thing to have discovered, because it makes us realize we have got the potential to change, and we've even our mindset around things like posture or sitting well, we might just unconsciously or subconsciously be holding a pattern that's really far too much effort. And that once we learn to think, can it be easier? Can I be easier in the way that I move and think and breathe? It just is liberating, really. And as you say, one of the things that we find is volume and space in the body. We start to sort of find poise in movement, and it's really such a change from an old idea of something being good or something being bad, or good posture is sort of sitting up and bad posture is sitting collapsed. And we start to find a freedom in movement that, I like to say this a lot, that where we're connecting rather than correcting. We're sort of connecting to the sense of space in ourselves and movement and the space around us, which is so helpful. That we have got so used to a sort of particular way of thinking that doesn't quite connect to sensing. So I think these different approaches in the lesson help us to this quality that we've all got, which is to receive the world and to receive our bodies. And we're also busy trying hard and moving and lists and all the things we've got to do. And this big idea of actually finding a bit of space for a moment, a bit of quiet, even we could just call it stopping, taking a moment to connect to really, it is actually a sense. And if our body is in, sometimes I like to call it surveillance, if we're constantly in a mode of surveillance with ourselves, registering stress and threat all the time, we find it very difficult to experience safety and ease in ourselves. And so within the Alexander lesson, I suppose what you're hoping to create is the space to find that sense of quiet, safe, and ease in each other together, that allows suddenly, when we don't feel under threat, it's a bit like being on the beach or suddenly thinking I've got a holiday, or I'm in the forest or on a mountain. You suddenly find space and time and ease within yourself, and this spatial connection to the environment. And some people used to call Alexander the breathing man.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Because he sort of helped people to notice that if you're in a state of anxiety or rushing, that we often call it holding our breath, or not breathing, but actually just creating tension, so that the conversation of the inner movement that breath creates with the outer structure gets lost. And once you know how to read that conversation, it's a bit like actively listening to yourself as well as each other. It just changes everything, I think.
It's wonderful what you say about to receive your body, which in that moment you said that. I was thinking about, it's an invitation to lean back, to almost drop back into the mass we inhabit. And I love, and I think it's so important what you also said about safety, and that if we do perceive our body and we literally notice the whole backside of your body. I very often think when we stress and when we are in fight and flight, how it's all about the front side of the body.
Exactly.
And we completely miss. And that gives us the power, or that gives us that potent tool that if we drop into our backsides, our body might receive a different message. What do you think?
I totally agree with you. That sense of volume and often, when you think of the sort of habits we all carry around with this, locking our legs, gripping our jaws, tightening our necks, tightening our ribcage. It's just so hard when you've got those sets and patterns to actually connect to this movement that's going on all the time. All these systems moving, the bloods, the hearts, the lungs. It's all movement, and it's really suppressed if we're under tension, or what we see quite a lot, don't we? A sort of massive collapse in the body when we sort of give up and just don't find our, I call it quiet strength of structure and support that's just really naturally there in gravity.
Tell us more about finding your quiet strength, if you don't mind, because you've written a whole book about finding quiet strength, and that's very much what was born out of your encounter with music and then Alexander technique.
Yes, very much so. And I think it's such a good little phrase, because there's so many different strengths, actually, even of the body. There's a sort of endurance strength. It's sort of almost like a biomechanical strength when the structure is stacking up nicely and in balance and poise. And there's that kind of endurance strength where we could stand for quite a long time, almost like Atlas. We could stand and find our resilient strength. And then there's another sort of strength, isn't there, which is flexibility and the ability to sort of go with the flow in life and do things and create beautiful images or writing or whatever it is that we do. And I think these sort of different types of strength really help me think that it's not a position that we're looking for in the body, it's a condition of ease that actually embraces both of those sorts of strengths that we see in nature so much, and that we all maybe have a bit more of one or a bit more of the other, but that we can draw on both when we know how to. And a breath is, of course, very much part of that. And the reason that I call it finding quiet strength is because, and you'll know this so well with your work, that it's a practice, really. It's not a destination.
Yes.
And all these things, like learning any skill, we can't expect to play the Tchaikovsky violin concerto in our first lesson, We need time, we need space to assimilate a new mindset, a growth mindset that helps us think we could connect to our body and breath and space in the everyday as well as at particular moments of performance maybe. So the finding, I like that word because it's sort of like an inquiry that's ongoing, and that we're not trying to be perfect because that's unsustainable, but that we're deepening a practice of a skill that really maybe we could think that the human race is slightly lost, perhaps, this connection with the body and the world around us. We've slightly lost that, and when we come back to it, you know, we do find a different strength in ourselves and an easier way to connect to each other, hopefully.
Wow.
Work in progress always, right?
Yeah, and you're so right. It's a practice, and it's also, I feel, about kind commitment to the practice or not. To say yes and I. And then I remember so well with I trained as a dancer initially, and it was so hard. And at one point, I had to make a very kind but firm commitment. And I work with compassion and softness with my body. And I do commit to find that quiet strength, which is not less powerful. No. It's also very potent, powerful, but a way of moving which is moving with our body rather than against it. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's so well put. The sort of yin and yang of ancient wisdom has always understood those two types of strength. The sort of masculine, feminine, sort of almost as well beyond that, sort of genderless kind of kindness that there can be when we connect, not correct, really.
I have a very spontaneous idea, Judith. Now I'm sitting on a recent chair, and I assume maybe many listeners sit at home on a chair or on the couch. Would you mind just 3-5 minutes actually take all of us through some thoughts or directions how we can, in this very moment, how would that look like if we, now that I sit on the chair, and how would that look like to connect and to find quiet strength? Would you mind?
Not at all. I'd be very happy to do that. Well, I suppose we would all just take a moment, and you might find it more helpful just to take a moment and connect if your eyes are closed. But if you'd like to keep your eyes open too, that's fine, but you choose, and that's a nice reminder, isn't it, that we can all choose how we are in the moment when we can. And then as you're sitting there quietly, you might like to notice just how your tongue and jaw are, and often those linguistic muscles and structures get caught up and tight, and if we just let them be easy, taking the tension out of the tongue and the jaw and the face. And just take a moment to let that land in our body and sort of absorb the experience of that. Yeah, and then when you're ready, bringing your attention and awareness to your sitting bones and the chair you're sitting on, and just let yourself again, I sometimes call it the downbeat. Find the downbeat in the body that allows yourself to really integrate the sense of being present in your whole body, on the chair, your feet on the floor if possible, and just letting yourself connect to the whole body, being easier. Just reminding ourselves as we're sitting here that we are breathing, and that the breathing has a little rhythm, or you could say it has a phrase. There's a phrase to breathing, and each breath is like a little cell or a little phrase that we just can tune into, breathing in, breathing out. And then that little peaceful pause there between the out breath and the next in breath. And it's quite nice just to take a moment to think, I'll just let my mind be aware of 5 breaths, breathing in, breathing out, peacefully pausing. And as you connect to that breath movement, you can just be aware of the movement being quite low in the body, really deep in the belly, as well as the rib cage. And that you're aware of the expansion of the in-breath and the release of the out-breath. As you come to the end of the 5 breaths, you can even notice the movement in the sides of your body, the back of your body. And seeing if you can really enjoy, for the last couple of breaths, maybe just slightly lengthening the out-breath. Feeling that release of the rib cage and the engagement in the belly. So you come to end of that little sequence, which I sometimes call that just entering a quiet mind and an easy body space. Just blinking your eyes to open. Coming back to the room.
Wow. Thank you, Judith.
The
good news is that it's all recorded, so people can just go back over and over back to these 5 minutes and take that as a first encounter of the Alexander technique. And as I was sitting here and closing my eyes, interesting, the first thing I noticed was how I suddenly started to notice the sensation of my feet on the ground, which I didn't do before. And then I felt the whole support from underneath. And in that moment, I felt the sense of
lovely,
more safety entering actually the whole space. And as you invited us to start to listen to the breath, I noticed how, wow, the Alexander technique, what do you think? It's actually also an invitation to, you said before, it enables us to come back to ourselves, and maybe by really tuning into the sensation of the breath, it did feel as if the breath was starting to fill my whole body. And in that way we do, I think in that moment, that is a gesture of coming back home to ourselves.
Definitely. And it's just so interesting. It's sort of as though sometimes we have blind spots, isn't it? And the senses can become a little unreliable as the brain predicts danger or anxiety, and it starts to create tension. And there's a really useful phrase, I think, that tension reduces sensation.
Yes.
And that as we let go of unnecessary tension, we might discover a little bit more sensation. And we're always doing that in a safe way, because sometimes it can be a little unusual or exciting if we're not used to it. But we're only ever exploring it as much as feels comfortable in that moment, because it's a big change. And I think, we deepen the connection. It's partly through an exploration of an inquiry into an anatomy.
Yes.
And it is so brilliant, because sometimes, I don't know, at school biology wasn't particularly interesting.
No.
But if we think of the exploration of discovering ourselves through an understanding of as almost like a physical literacy, that we, a lot of us know how our instruments or our cars or our phones work more than how we work. And some of the structures, particularly of the breath, are just so useful to know about. To discover the movement and the journey of the diaphragm, and the height and depth and width of the lungs, and how the rib cage jointed into the spine, and so there's all these movable structures interrelating together, and what they're doing is communicating with the nervous system, sort of monitoring, am I safe to release? Am I safe to breathe a little bit more deeply, or do I need to get out of here quickly, or have a fight, or what, these different signals we get. And so the nervous system's journey from fight and fight to rest and digest, in the middle of those two extremes is this quiet strength, as I call it, or this balance.
That very soft spot, I sometimes call it the soft spot, or a fertile ground.
And then that's really wonderful, because we can reframe not so much relaxing as collapsing, but relaxing as releasing, and having a really constructive connection to our energy. Because we know that sometimes if we've been overstressed, a lot of us actually even collapse into a state of depression, or less likely to move and run and find the joy of being active. And that was one of the things that Alexander really helped me with, was finding a movement practice that also could incorporate the breath. And there's a slightly more active element of Alexander work, which sort of works with movement and the development of movement from childhood to adulthood. And we see that in cultures where, older folk don't look so collapsed. We don't associate aging with collapsing, but we see an ease and a poise travelling through our lives, which I'm very interested in as I get older. And we all want to get older with poise, and when things happen to us, change, which is, the constant, they say, don't they? That we can choose to change and go with the flow with more ease, I suppose.
Yeah, and that poise and ease, it is our nature, right? And even though we might live in a society or in a speed where we forget about it, our body deep down, it still knows, and it is our true nature. And I think that is also where I'm an osteopath, where actually Alexander taking osteopathy share so many similarities, because you as a teacher, as an osteopath, you don't try to fix any student, or we don't try to correct or to do it, but to support the body to a place where it can undo or unwind, and that might be why we have back pain or feel collapse, and you go and see an Alexander teacher, and without looking at the back pain where it is, but we support, what's happening there. We support the body to
move.
To move. We support the body to move. Yes.
And I think
health is movement.
Exactly. Some people say movement is medicine, which I really like. And I think we've become such a sedentary society in a way. And if we can find a good relationship, especially with technology, I think that we use it creatively, but also remind ourselves to keep moving and not get stuck
Yeah.
And that is on a sort of mental, emotional level as well as a physical level, because sometimes it isn't, just emotional trauma, but just sitting at a computer for hours and hours that creates pain and discomfort, and that's very hard to bear, isn't it?
How do you that? How do you do that, Judith? What are your movement practices, or how do you stay in motion?
Yes, that's
you?
a good question. Well, there's a strand of Alexander work which I suppose is looking at daily activity, standing, sitting, walking, or lying down. But there's also this developmental movement, I sometimes like to call it, which was which is another branch of Alexander work. It's called Dart movement.
Yeah.
And it's very very, very beautiful. So I do incorporate that in my teaching, especially with groups and musicians, because I think it is useful to have a movement practice. And then I also teach Tai Chi and yoga, and I like to think that it's a bit like, I think some people call it diffuse learning, that if we over concentrate on one thing, like the violin, for example, sometimes we can get stuck in such serious patterns, and that it's really good sometimes to just imagine playing the flute or singing or going for a walk as a way of learning in a wider context. And I think that's important, because if we over focus on one way of doing things, it can be limiting. And sometimes, life teaches us, how to be easy with ourselves when we realise the concert's over, or the burden of a task is finished, and we suddenly go, and that sigh of relief reminds us what it is to be easier with ourselves. And in a way, that's what we identify through Alexander work or movement work. We identify these different tensions and expressions of them in the body.
Wow. You mentioned again tension. There is still left this. I know you, Alexander. What we now did was that little sequence you led us through was something we can all do on a daily basis for ourselves. And if we see an Alexander teacher, then the element of the teacher's hands and the touch is really important. And that's one of the skills which I assume is the one which really gets trained when one trains an Alexander teacher, how to use one's hands through the media of touch to facilitate change, or to support the student to undo all the things we now talked about. That maybe if we still have time, I would love to hear from you. How do you use touch and your hands when you work with a student, and what are these miraculous and very mysterious processes which we facilitate with our hands?
Great question. And I think it's good to say that training to be an Alexander teacher or an osteopath or any of these wonderful modalities that are out there does take time, because you're not only working on yourself, but you are learning the art of touch and connection. And I work at a training course in Highbury called the LCAT, and any of your listeners are very, very welcome to come and visit us there, because it actually does take 3 years to train to be an Alexander teacher if you do a classical training. And that sounds extraordinary amount of time, but it takes a long time to undo an old pattern
Yeah.
Especially of touch, because we're so used to grasping and holding things, and that tension going right the way through the body. And I sometimes like to think of it as the touch integrating with the other senses of the body, including breath and movement and space and time, so that the touch is really conveying the body, as you say, allowing the body to undo a set that it's got caught up in. And the touch connects to this community of sensing. A bit, I mean, we think of it sometimes, don't we, as like a synesthesia. And some people, when they hear a sound, they see a colour. But the community of sensing is, touch is so close to muscle tone, these dermatomes in the skin touch, connecting into the same nervous system as the sense of muscular release, or the sense of the muscles understanding space. So it is quite simple in that you put your hands on people, but the complexity of it is that you're connecting to yourself as well as to the other person. So that thought we had earlier, in that you're composing yourself via touch into your whole self, and then that helps the other person. A bit like two bells ringing together. And that through that touch connection, it opens out the sense of now, really. The sense of being in the moment, in your body, in the space. And it's just incredible. And you start to be aware in a way that you just couldn't have been before, because we were in a habitual time and space mode. So I call the regulators of the body touch, movement, breath, thought, but also time and space. I think those are self-regulators. And that, well, the way I teach is that I also teach people how to put hands on themselves in a way that in the moment, for example, maybe all of us could now just put our hands on our hearts and our hand on our belly. And just the way that connects us to the movement, the inner conversation, as we were saying earlier, of lungs and diaphragm and belly and guts, along with the outer structure. And you just get the sense of breath actually being movement through touch.
I love that, breath being movement through touch. And it's such a touching invitation to use our own hands and our own touch to meet the movement of the breath within, which is life, which is health, which is that place from where our body can regulate.
Exactly. And Alexander...
And heal.
Yes, heal. And it wants to heal itself.
It wants to heal, yes.
Yeah, it wants to heal itself. And Alexander noticed, and a bit like the discipline of Buteyko or other... There's James Nestor's beautiful book on breath, of course. But Alexander also noticed that a lot of people, we just get into slightly tricky patterns of breathing, say with our mouths, or some people call it over-breathing, we're gasping a lot when we speak. And this thought of being able to connect to a quieter pattern of breath, which is so interesting, because really as soon as we have a thought or an emotion, our breath changes. And it's just interesting to notice those. How do we breathe when we're under pressure? Or how do we, as we said earlier, breathe when we feel a sense of relief? We often have a long sigh or breath out. And how do we manage that ability to observe it in a way that's really kind, and to say that, and helps us to bring it back to an easier pattern.
That's a good reminder that, yes, that our breath immediately changes depending on what we think, them and our thoughts, because that again gives us this very soft power to use the breath as a tool to maybe in these moments, wherever listeners are in that moment, to just, and with whatever thoughts are going through our mind or situation we're in, we can just notice, how is my breath? Could I use the beats down? That's what you used before. I loved that. What happens if I change my breath?
I love that, and because of music, sometimes I say, is your breath in a constant fortissimo state?
That's a lovely way to
ask. Bring a bit of piano or moderato.
You would never play fortissimo for 1 hour with the violin, wouldn't you?
Well, it would be maybe pretty hard. And then that thought that we're not. Also, it's so important, isn't it, for us to say, we're not saying it's wrong to be anxious, or it's not wrong to be frightened, or all those things are very natural, and but we don't want to normalize them. We don't want them to be the constant state. We want the state to be movable and changeable, so that we can enjoy moments of heightened energy or awareness, but that we can regulate back to quiet and ease as well, that we've got the sort of our hands on the temperature gauge, I suppose, or the volume gauge, maybe.
That's wonderful. We started the conversation, it was very quickly about that we have a choice, and I feel we now almost made a whole circle, come back to that we have a choice. It's not about correcting or fixing, but to get to a place of freedom, to have a choice. How do I want to move and carry my body and my whole self? How do I want to meet my body and myself?
And that so integrates with how do I want to be with other people? Do I want to be reactive, or
how do I want to meet the world?
Actively listen and be ready? And we sometimes we lose it, and that's fine too, but most of the time we all know we make better choices when we're calm. We move more freely, and it's just so great to feel in charge of ourselves when we can. When we can't, it's probably time to go to bed or have a hot bath.
To listen to that message as well. Judith, for all the listeners who would like to learn more about the Alexander technique, or maybe particularly your work, your book, would you mind I will put all the more details in the show notes, but maybe tell us how can people connect with your work, with you? How can people work and learn from you?
Thank you so much. What a lovely thought. Well, I've got a website called Finding Quiet Strength, and my book is published by a very lovely publishing company called Quickthorn Books, but you can also get it on Amazon, and actually now it's also available online. You can buy it online as a book. And I think also, if anybody's interested to visit the training course where I teach or have a lesson, do be in touch. But I think just Googling Quiet Strength or the Alexander technique, there's so much out there now. And it's applied to the performing arts, but it's also just so good to know how to sit on a chair and feel comfortable, or stand and I sometimes call it vertically rest rather than feel uncomfortable when we're standing, or overpowered when we're learn how to be in performance, but also in every day. I think I'd really encourage everyone
Yeah,
to just explore it a little bit. Yeah.
I will put all these details in show notes. If I remember right, on your webpage, you also have this lovely sequence where you lead people, I think it's around 10 minutes, through a lying down sequence. So for all of you who felt that was interesting what we did today on the chair on Judith's website, you can find a lovely sequence lying on the back, which I do from time to time, and it's always great.
Thank you, Serena. Yeah.
I love to pose with ease that one question in the end. What is the one thing from your work or from this conversation? It doesn't matter. What is there the one thing or word which you would like to take the listeners with them in this very moment?
That's interesting. Well, I suppose the phrase I use a lot is to just think, can it be easier? And that I also have a little way of thinking that, and one of my very dear girlfriends, we've developed it, and we call it the ready list.
The ready list.
And the ready list is stop, see, breathe, and be soft and tall. And it's like you're asking yourself those questions in the moment. Can I stop for a moment? Can I see the big picture, or receive the big picture of space and time? Can I breathe with my whole body? In, out, and peacefully pause. And then can I just think into my body to allow it to be soft and tall? And it's a jolly good practice. And there's a lovely website, the Ready List website.
I'll put that into the show notes.
Yeah, great.
Wow.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful place to stop.
Thank
you so much, Judith, for
very welcome
talking with me. I feel inspired from you. Thank you for your time. And
very welcome. Thank you. It's always nice to share together about the work.
And to try to find words for something which is so difficult to find words for.
That's a good point. And I think, again, it's just it's a conversation, isn't it? It's an ongoing conversation, ongoing inquiry.
Yes.
We don't have to get it right.
No.
Because something else will come up tomorrow and we think, oh yeah, I like that, I'll have that.
I love that. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, and that you found inspiration in what Judith shared. I'm looking forward reading your thoughts and comments about it on Instagram or Facebook or any podcast platform you are listening from at the moment. Tell me, what did you take from this episode and how did it inspire your path and journey? And share with me and Judith, what did you experience when you sat on the chair and dropped into your own breathing, allowing it to move your body? You can see where to find me and the breathing body, as well as Judith, in the show notes. And as always, a huge thank you to the band Aspirian, who is playing the wonderful intro and outro music. You can find the full track and all their details in the show notes too. I wish you a wonderful day and week. Trust your feet, body and heart. Love, Florina.